The Dark Enlightenment Part 2, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards zombie apocalypse. Nick Land. David Graeber, it strikes me that if one is going to pursue this to its logical conclusion, the only way to have a genuinely democratic society would also be to abolish capitalism in this state. Marina Citrin, we can't have democracy with capitalism. Democracy and capitalism don't work together. Here, via John J. Miller. That's always the trouble with history. It always looks like it's over. But it never is. Mencius Moldbug. Googling democracy and liberty together is highly enlightening, in a dark way. In cyberspace, at least, it is clear that only a distinct minority think of these terms as positively coupled. If opinion is to be judged in terms of the Google spider and its digital prey, by far the most prevalent association is disjunctive, or antagonistic, drawing upon the reactionary insight that democracy poses a lethal menace to liberty, all but ensuring its eventual eradication. Democracy is to liberty as gargantua to a pie. Surely you can see that we love liberty, to the point of gut rumbling and salivation. Steve H. Hank lays out the case authoritatively in his short essay on democracy versus liberty, focused upon the American experience. Most people, including most Americans, would be surprised to learn that the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence, 1776, or the Constitution of the United States of America, 1789. They would also be shocked to learn the reason for the absence of the word democracy in the founding documents of the USA. Contrary to what propaganda has led the public to believe, America's founding fathers were skeptical and anxious about democracy. They were aware of the evils that accompany a tyranny of the majority. The framers of the Constitution went to great lengths to ensure that the federal government was not based on the will of the majority and was not, therefore, democratic. If the framers of the Constitution did not embrace democracy, what did they adhere to? To a man, the framers agreed that the purpose of government was to secure citizens in John Locke's trilogy of the rights to life, liberty and property. He elaborates. The Constitution is primarily a structural and procedural document that itemizes who is to exercise power and how they are to exercise it. A great deal of stress is placed on the separation of powers and the checks and balances in the system. These were not a Cartesian construct or formula aimed at social engineering, but a shield to protect the people from the government. In short, the Constitution was designed to govern the government, not the people. The Bill of Rights establishes the rights of the people against infringements by the state. The only thing that the citizens can demand from the state, under the Bill of Rights, is for a trial by a jury. The rest of the citizens' rights are protections from the state. For roughly a century after the Constitution was ratified, private property, contracts and free internal trade within the United States were sacred. The scope and scale of the government remained very constrained. All this was very consistent with what was understood to be liberty. As the spirit of reaction digs its Sith tentacles into the brain, it becomes difficult to remember how the classical, or non-communist, progressive narrative could once have made sense. What were people thinking? What were they expecting from the emerging super-empowered, populist, cannibalistic state? Wasn't the eventual calamity entirely predictable? How was it ever possible to be a Whig? The ideological credibility of radical democratization is not, of course, in question. As thinkers ranging from Christian progressive, Walter Russell Mead to atheistic reactionary, Mencius Moldbug have exhaustively detailed, it conforms so exactly to ultra-Protestant religious enthusiasm that its power to animate the revolutionary soul should surprise nobody. Within just a few years of Martin Luther's challenge to the papal establishment, peasant insurrectionists were stringing up their class enemies all over Germany. The empirical credibility of democratic advancement is far more perplexing, and also genuinely complex, which is to say controversial, or more precisely, worthy of a data-based, rigorously argued controversy. In part, that is because the modern configuration of democracy emerges within the sweep of a far broader modernistic trend, whose techno-scientific, economic, social and political strands are obscurely interrelated, knitted together by misleading correlations, and subsequent false causalities. If, as Schumpeter argues, industrial capitalism tends to engender a democratic bureaucratic culture that concludes in stagnation, it might nevertheless seem as though democracy was associated with material progress. It is easy to misconstrue a lagging indicator as a positive causal factor, especially when ideological zeal lends its bias to the misapprehension. In similar vein, since cancer only afflicts living beings, it might, with apparent reason, be associated with vitality. Robin Hanson gently notes. Yes, many trends have been positive for a century or so, and yes, this suggests they will continue to rise for a century or so. But no, this does not mean that students are empirically or morally wrong for thinking it utopian fantasy that one could end poverty, disease, tyranny, and war by joining a modern-day Kennedy's political quest. Why? Because positive recent trends in these areas were not much caused by such political movements. They were mostly caused by our getting rich from the Industrial Revolution, an event that political movements tended, if anything, to try to hold back on average. Simple historical chronology suggests that industrialization supports progressive democratization, rather than being derived from it. This observation has even given rise to a widely accepted school of pop social science theorizing, according to which the maturation of societies in a democratic direction is determined by thresholds of affluence, or middle-class formation. The strict logical correlate of such ideas, that democracy is fundamentally non-productive in relation to material progress, is typically underemphasized. Democracy consumes progress. When perceived from the perspective of the Dark Enlightenment, the appropriate mode of analysis for studying the democratic phenomenon is general parasitology. Quasi-libertarian responses to the outbreak accept this implicitly. Given a population deeply infected by the zombie virus and shambling into cannibalistic social collapse, the preferred option is quarantine. It is not communicative isolation that is essential, but a functional dis-solidarization of society that tightens feedback loops and exposes people with maximum intensity to the consequences of their own actions. Social solidarity, in precise contrast, is the parasite's friend. By cropping out all high-frequency feedback mechanisms, such as market signals, and replacing them with sluggish, infrared loops that pass through a centralized forum of general will, a radically democratized society insulates parasitism from what it does, transforming local, painfully dysfunctional, intolerable, and thus urgently corrected behavior patterns into global, numbed, and chronic socio-political pathologies. Gnaw off other people's body parts and it might be hard to get a job. That's the kind of lesson a tight feedback, cybernetically intense, laissez-faire order would allow to be learned. It's also exactly the kind of insensitive zombie-phobic discrimination that any compassionate democracy would denounce as thought crime, whilst boosting the public budget for the vitally challenged, undertaking consciousness-raising campaigns on behalf of those suffering from involuntary cannibalistic impulse syndrome, affirming the dignity of the zombie lifestyle in higher education curriculums, and rigorously regulating workspaces to ensure that the shuffling undead are not victimized by profit-obsessed, performance-centric, or even unreconstructed animationist employers. As enlightened zombie tolerance flourishes in the shelter of the democratic megaparasite, a small remnant of reactionaries, attentive to the effects of real incentives, raise the formulaic question: you do realize that these policies lead inevitably to a massive expansion of the zombie population? The dominant vector of history presupposes that such nuisance objections are marginalized, ignored, and, wherever possible, silenced through social ostracism. The remnant either fortifies the basement, whilst stocking up on dried food, ammunition, and silver coins, or accelerates the application process for a second passport, and starts packing its bags. If all of this seems to be coming inward from historical concreteness, there's a conveniently topical remedy, a little digressive channel hopping over to Greece. As a microcosmic model for the death of the West, playing out in real time, the Greek story is hypnotic. It describes a 2,500-year arc that is far from neat, but irresistibly dramatic, from proto-democracy to accomplished zombie apocalypse. Its preeminent virtue is that it perfectly illustrates the democratic mechanism in extremis, separating individuals and local populations from the consequences of their decisions by scrambling their behavior through large-scale, centralized redistribution systems. You decide what you do, but then vote on the consequences. How could anyone say no to that? No surprise that over 30 years of EU membership, Greeks have been eagerly cooperating with a social engineering mega-project that strips out all shortwave social signals and reroutes feedback through the grandiose circuitry of European solidarity, ensuring that all economically relevant information is red-shifted through the heat-death sump of the European Central Bank. Most specifically, it has conspired with Europe to obliterate all information that might be contained in Greek interest rates, thus effectively disabling all financial feedback on domestic policy choices. This is democracy in a consummate form that defies further perfection, since nothing conforms more exactly to the general will than the legislative abolition of reality, and nothing delivers the hemlock to reality more definitively than the coupling of Teutonic interest rates with East Mediterranean spending decisions. Live like Hellenes and pay like Germans, any political party that failed to rise to power on that platform deserves to scrabble for vulture-picked scraps in the wilderness. It's the ultimate no-brainer, in just about every imaginable sense of that expression. What could possibly go wrong? More to the point, what did go wrong? Mencius Moldbug begins his unqualified reservation series How Dawkins Got Pwned, or taken over through an exploitable vulnerability, with the outlining of design rules for a hypothetical optimal mimetic parasite that would be as virulent as possible. It will be highly contagious, highly morbid, and highly persistent. A really ugly bug. In comparison to this ideological superplague, the vestigial monotheism derided in the God delusion would figure as nothing worse than a moderately unpleasant head cold. What begins as abstract meme tinkering concludes as grand sweep history, in the Dark Enlightenment mode. My belief is that Professor Dawkins is not just a Christian atheist. He is a Protestant atheist. And he is not just a Protestant atheist. He is a Calvinist atheist. And he is not just a Calvinist atheist. He is an Anglo-Calvinist atheist. In other words, he can be also described as a Puritan atheist, a dissenter atheist, a nonconformist atheist, an evangelical atheist, etc., etc. This cladistic taxonomy traces Professor Dawkins' intellectual ancestry back about 400 years, to the era of the English Civil War. Except of course for the atheism theme, Professor Dawkins' kernel is a remarkable match for the ranter, leveler, digger, Quaker, fifth monarchist, or any of the more extreme English dissenter traditions that flourished during the Cromwellian interregnum. Frankly, these dudes were freaks. Maniacal fanatics. Any mainstream English thinker of the 17th, 18th or 19th century, informed that this tradition, or its modern descendant, is now the planet's dominant Christian denomination, would regard this as a sign of imminent apocalypse. If you're sure they're wrong, you're more sure than me. Fortunately, Cromwell himself was comparatively moderate. The extreme ultra-Puritan sects never got a solid lock on power under the Protectorate. Even more fortunately, Cromwell got old and died, and Cromwellism died with him. Lawful government was restored to Great Britain, as was the Church of England, and dissenters became a marginal fringe again. And frankly, a damned good riddance it was. However, you can't keep a good parasite down. A community of Puritans fled to America and founded the theocratic colonies of New England. After its military victories in the American Rebellion and the War of Secession, American Puritanism was well on the way to world domination. Its victories in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War confirmed its global hegemony. All legitimate mainstream thought on Earth today is descended from the American Puritans, and through them the English dissenters. Given the rise of this really ugly bug to world dominion, it might seem strange to pick on tangential figures such as Dawkins, but Moldbug selects his target for exquisitely judged strategic reasons. Moldbug identifies with Dawkins' Darwinism, with his intellectual repudiation of Abrahamic theism, and with his broad commitment to scientific rationality. Yet he recognizes, crucially, that Dawkins' critical faculties shut off, abruptly and often comically, at the point where they might endanger a still broader commitment to hegemonic progressivism. In this way, Dawkins is powerfully indicative. Militant secularism is itself a modernized variant of the Abrahamic metameme, on its Anglo-Protestant, radical democratic taxonomic branch, whose specific tradition is anti-traditionalism. The clamorous atheism of the God delusion represents a protective feint, and a consistent upgrade of religious reformation, guided by a spirit of progressive enthusiasm that trumps empiricism and reason, whilst exemplifying an irritable dogmatism that rivals anything to be found in earlier God-themed strains. Dawkins isn't merely an enlightened modern progressive and implicit radical Democrat, he's an impressively credentialed scientist, more specifically a biologist, and, thus, a Darwinian evolutionist. The point at which he touches the limit of acceptable thinking as defined by the mimetic superbug is therefore quite easy to anticipate. His inherited tradition of low church ultra-Protestantism has replaced God with man as the locus of spiritual investment, and man has been in the process of Darwinian research dissolution for over 150 years. As the sound, decent person I know you are, having gotten this far with Moldbug, you're probably already muttering under your breath, "Don't mention race, don't mention race, don't mention race, please, oh please, in the name of the zeitgeist and the dear sweet non-God of progress, don't mention race." But Moldbug is already citing Dawkins, citing Thomas Huxley in a contest which is to be carried out by thoughts and not by bites. The highest places in the hierarchy of civilization will assuredly not be within the reach of our dusky cousins. Which Dawkins frames by remarking, had Huxley been born and educated in our time, he would have been the first to cringe with us at his Victorian sentiments and unctuous tone. I put them only to illustrate how the zeitgeist moves on. It gets worse. Moldbug seems to be holding Huxley's hand, and, ew, doing that palm-stroking thing with his finger. This sure ain't vanilla libertarian reaction anymore, it's getting seriously dark and scary. In all seriousness, what is the evidence for fraternism? Why, exactly, does Professor Dawkins believe that all neo-hominids are born with identical potential for neurological development? He doesn't say. Perhaps he thinks it's obvious. Whatever one's opinion on the respective scientific merits of human biological diversity or uniformity, it is surely beyond contention that the latter assumption, alone, is tolerated. Even if progressive universalistic beliefs about human nature are true, they are not held because they are true, or arrived at through any process that passes the Laff test for critical scientific rationality. They are received as religious tenets, with all of the passionate intensity that characterizes essential items of faith, and to question them is not a matter of scientific inaccuracy, but of what we now call political incorrectness, and once knew as heresy. To sustain this transcendent moral posture in relation to racism is no more rational than subscription to the doctrine of original sin, of which it is, in any case, the unmistakable modern substitute. The difference, of course, is that original sin is a traditional doctrine, subscribed to by an embattled social cohort, significantly underrepresented among public intellectuals and media figures, deeply unfashionable in the dominant world culture, and widely criticized, if not derided, without any immediate assumption that the critic is advocating murder, theft, or adultery. To question the status of racism as the supreme and defining social sin, on the other hand, is to court universal condemnation from social elites, and to arouse suspicions of thought crimes that range from pro-slavery apologetics to genocide fantasies. Racism is pure or absolute evil, whose proper sphere is the infinite and the eternal, or the incendiary sinful depths of the hyper-Protestant soul, rather than the mundane confines of civil interaction, social scientific realism, or efficient and proportional legality. The dissymmetry of affect, sanction, and raw social power attending old heresies and their replacements, once noticed, is a nagging indicator. A new sect reigns, and it is not even especially well hidden. Yet even among the most hardened HBD constituencies, hysterical sanctification of plus good race think hardly suffices to lend radical democracy the aura of profound morbidity that Moldbug detects. That requires a devotional relation to the state.